Welcome to the final video series for the final chapter of our book. We'll be looking at chapter 13, Varieties of English. So we've been talking a lot about grammar specifically and getting into some nitty-gritty details of grammar. So now it's good to kind of take a step back and look at the wider picture of language. The English language specifically, but just language in general. As future educators, whether you're going to be specifically teaching English and ELA or ESL in high school, or you're going to middle school, or you're going to be in elementary school, where you're going to be teaching reading, writing, and language. What does it mean? What are some things to keep in mind as someone who's going to be teaching a language? And so the first question to ask yourself is, what is a language? What makes up a language? We usually think of the words, the vocabulary, how do you say this in English? What do you call that in French? So of course, that's the obvious example. And then we've been talking all semester about grammar and all the stuff that grammar entails. Is there anything else? Right? What other aspects or characteristics might we include when we think about a language? If we look at all of the languages spoken in the world today, there are thousands, and we often talk about living languages. A living language is a language that's actively being taught to children, that will be passed down to the next generation. And out of all those thousands of languages in the world, which there are about 7,000, but of course, it's hard to numerically count every single language because that number is constantly in flux. We learn more about languages every day. And, which languages are being spoken more or less is always changing. 7,000 languages, 40%, almost half, are endangered. So there are less than 1,000 people on the planet speaking those languages. They're not being taught to children. They're not being passed. So once the current speakers die, those languages die with them. And just 23 languages out of that 7,000 are spoken by more than half of the world's population. So you've got a very small number of languages being spoken by a few billion people, and then you've got a large number of languages that are being spoken by just a little bit. Well, English is one of those languages. Of course, it's one of the most spoken languages in the world. Is there one language that we can call English? Or are there many different varieties? Dialects, accents, vocabulary. Where do we draw those lines of variation when we talk about English? And you're going to be teaching English, and a lot of teachers go into it thinking there's the correct way to say something, the correct way to spell something, the correct grammar, the correct way to write things. But what standard of English are we using to make that judgment call and say this is right or wrong, this is correct or incorrect? Which English are you teaching? Right? So English right now is being spoken by more than 350 million native speakers, right? So those are people who learn English first from birth, right? But there are 1 billion or so speakers who speak English as a second language or third language, right? So more people on this planet speak English as their additional language. Okay, people like me and probably you who grew up learning English as your native language, we're outnumbered, right? We're the minority. Okay, and then out of what we consider the English language, there are about, depending on how you draw those lines and make those distinctions, roughly 160 different dialects in the world. You can think about country-wise, you can talk about American English versus Australian English or British English, but then even in those countries, you can start dividing up the countries. Heck, just here in this area, there may be a lot of variation from town to town, right? So a lot of differences pop up, okay? And remember, when we talk about dialect, we're not talking about accent. The way you pronounce words is one part of a dialect, but dialectical differences could be not just pronunciation, it could be vocabulary, the very words you choose, and it could be the grammar, the structure of the language, right? And it could also be higher order language skills of discourse, on that discourse level, how we use the language for communication. There are a lot of different differences when we talk about dialects. It's not just accent. Okay, so again, pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, there could be all kinds of differences. And those differences can be in a very short area. If you leave Lafayette and you drive, if I drive to Ville Platte, say, I was going to say Abbeville. Yeah, if you go to Abbeville, you'll hear things differently. If you go to Ville Platte, Louisiana, where I have family, it's noticeably different. Just their pronunciation of things is different. Some of the words they use is different, right? And if you drive into Texas, you're going to get yeehaw, and Texas is going to be different than if we drive back east into Mississippi. So, you don't have to go far to start hearing dialectical differences. Here's a big difference, okay? Thinking beyond just the United States, if we go to the island of Jamaica, we hear patois, which is it an English dialect? They do use a lot of the same words, and they have some structural similarities. Is it a dialect of English, or is it different enough to be considered a completely different language? Let's take a listen.
The people of Goshen say about a month ago, one of Calvin Barrett's cows started acting strangely. The residents say the 63-year-old farmer and others have been trying to catch the animal since then. Yesterday, the cow killed its owner.
And last week, Saturday, around the 4:30 hours, right on the main street, we go Mitcham District. Me running the cow coming down on the road, and a buyer come to buy the cow, but they could not get the cow. So same time now, the cow and the calf coming down and some more cow, and same time we come and we come to buy the cow now. So we must hold on. So me hold on now and the cow jump over the wire now, and the mother come buy kitty calf. I came over the cow farm over here, so. And over conversation now we come over there go on until this man, when we up so now, but the district don't say cow, but he want to feed.
This resident says Mr. Barrett tried to use the cow's calf to trap him on Thursday. Obviously, that attempt also failed. Errol Green said he's shocked that the animal snapped like that. And while it's not yet certain why the cow killed its owner, there are speculations.
I want a simple little cow, I don't know say him bad. For, look like him bad.
So you may have rope running it?
Yeah, you may have one little piece of rope running it. I don't know if a hole in rope or what do, but I don't know how I can get to buck him. When me come and look, it look like say in ram in hand in her neck or what. I don't know if I cut in neck with the hand, but I see blood a come. I'm going to see Trevor hold him up.
In the meantime, residents say since the fatal incident, the animal has attacked at least 2 other residents.
And that is Calvin, brother Allah, he make about after brother Calvin. He was seeing pants foot too. And great pan in the and he went to the pan in the street once now. And then in Boca Raton is going in King James, Boca time, and he might chop him. And in Bolton that bush was now. So I don't know about him for that.
Mr. Sam is reporting for TVJ News.
Okay, I think they're probably correct in saying that without the subtitles, we would be completely lost. But having the subtitles, there were a few words that I could hear when he said cow. It sounded more like go, right? And there were, I heard when they said King James, I heard the King James, and there were a few other words that popped up here and there. So some of it was pronunciation, and I don't know how these words are spelled in Jamaica, but the spelling might be similar. It might be easier to read it than hear it. So is it a very strong pronunciation difference with some difference in vocabulary? Or is this so different that we're going to say it's not even English anymore? This is a completely different language. Where do you draw that line? Because of course there's a continuum, right? When the language starts drifting apart, pronunciation becomes different, grammar becomes different, the words, the vocabulary becomes different. Where do you label this? A dialect, or we're going to label it as a separate language? And the same thing happens with other countries. We go into Ireland, where they ostensibly speak English. Now, Ireland has its own language, but most people in Ireland, speak English. A lot of them speak English only, but we go into rural Ireland, and let's take a listen to this guy. Farmers are always great.
Gardaí in County Kerry are investigating the theft of up to 60 sheep on Mount Brandon. One of the farmers is offering a reward for information leading to the return of the ewes, which are worth thousands of euro.
Well, then find them. That's right, and you own them in. And you want to see it, find them.
Last Saturday, Mikey Joe O'Shea brought his flock of Scotch sheep down from the mountain commonage ahead of lambing. He discovered over 50 were missing. Allowing for a number of deaths and strays, Mikey is convinced over 45 sheep have been stolen.
Possibly a night, there'd be a full moon there about night, and it should be bright out, and there could anyone go up in the mountains about night, sure. Well, there was 45 sheep missing, like, and the lambs and everything, and the sheep, to count out a nice bit of money, like. To be done about it, nothing.
Mikey's next door neighbour says some of his sheep have also been stolen.
Come back. I'm missing about 10 ewes. It's not all that difficult. All you got to do is have a good dog. Have a good dog and go at night, some moonshine night, just put the dog around him, put him on a trailer or walk him. And then probably somebody else to pick him up. Whoever is doing it knows what he's doing.
Okay, again, I think we would probably have more difficulty following what's going on. Thank God for subtitles. But here again, the pronunciation is very different than you or I, but there are some words I can make out. Instead of cows, we have sheep now, but dog becomes dag, and we see a lot of pronunciation differences. Seems as much difference as the Jamaican patois, or maybe more difference. Or less difference. So again, would this be a stronger case for just a regional dialect of English that they're speaking in Ireland? Or, would you be talking to this guy and say, I have no idea what you're talking about. This is a different language. So a lot of things to think about when you enter the field of teaching. If you have students from other countries, if they learned English in their home country, what form of English did they learn? Okay. If you're teaching and if you end up at a school district and you're teaching kids who are in an area where you did not grow up, right? If you move to another town, another state, they are going to have grown up speaking an English that's different than the English you grew up speaking. How are you going to navigate those differences as a teacher? And if you have a mixed classroom, especially if you're going into a larger city where you have maybe kids who are coming in, not just from other countries, but other parts of the country and mixing all together, how do you recognize and deal with all of those differences, right? You, as a teacher, saying, hey, you're doing that wrong. But they grew up hearing it that way their whole life. So we have to think about those things and be careful about those things. Okay. So leaving aside Jamaica and Ireland and Australia, just coming into our own country, the United States, in our next video, we're going to look at some dialects right here in the good old US of A. Stay tuned. Please check out video number 2.